Going to talk a little bit about Chief Seattle's speech. So here are some of the things we did well. We identified Chief Seattle's purpose, and there's probably 9 or 10 different purposes that you could have chosen. So here are just a couple of the ones I pulled out of all the students' writing. So to persuade Governor Stevens against buying land and making more Indian reservations, to persuade Governor Stevens that Chief Seattle and Native American people are educated, wise, and aware of the exploitative situation, to elicit sympathy, to connect with Governor Isaac Stevens through shared experiences. For example, they both have the same government and they're both leaders. To educate the governor about Chief Seattle's cultural traditions and belief systems. To contrast the two peoples by way of their numbers, God versus God. A lot of you picked up on that. The afterlife and the concept of land ownership. To establish himself, Seattle, as the leader and a force with whom to be reckoned. Some of you who used tone identified that one. To mock the white man versus subtle and sly sarcasm, and to warn the governor about hubris. So all of these are correct. Here are some things that we need to work on. Avoid qualifiers. When you qualify in speech, you might be critical and you're using a qualification to downplay your critique. It's a common thing that people do when speaking, but avoid this in writing. So instead of saying Chief Seattle is just trying to, say Chief Seattle argues that. So be assertive and use says, argues, determines, explains. Another form of qualifier is basically he's saying, you don't need to paraphrase this, just go with what he's saying. It's better to have a weak supported argument than to hedge around an opinion with insecurities and no support. A lot of you are saying Chief Seattle begins to, starts to, goes to. It's kind of like, it's like, goes on to say. Avoid all these phrasings. Just go with Seattle says. Be confident. All right, spelling. This is a big one, especially if the words are in the prompt. So here are some words that were in the prompt. Governor, Isaac, Chief Seattle, rhetorical, and oration, which is a speech. Make sure that you spell all the words that are in the prompt correctly. They give them to you, so you really need to be able to spell them correctly. All right, let's talk about appropriate quoting. So as you can see there, Miss Ahi says, comma, open the quotation marks, then put in the quote, okay? Put the punctuation in, and then close the quote. The punctuation goes within the quote. It's almost better if you could avoid big block quotes and use partial quotes or paraphrase. All right, these are some present tense forms that you can say to make an argument. Says, argues that, details, explains, compares. Attributions. So your first attribution, you always want to introduce the person. So Chief Seattle and Governor Isaac I. Stevens, or you could have said Isaac I. Stevens, Governor. Second reference is the last name, Seattle, or second reference is Governor Stevens, without the first name. Third reference for Seattle would be he. Third reference for Governor Stevens would be Stevens. And then fourth reference would be he. But since these are both males, we're going to avoid the he altogether because your reader doesn't know which he you're talking about. So just Seattle or just Stevens. And by the way, you wouldn't want to call him Chief. A lot of you did this. That would be the equivalent of calling Coach Mayer Mr. Instead of the last name. So avoid just calling him Chief. All right, references to diction, ethos, logos, and pathos. So you can't use these the way you would say he used a hammer. So he used diction, or he used ethos, or he used logos. These are incorrect. What you want to say is you want to allude to it like his diction reflected his sadness, his sarcastic diction. I would identify what kind of diction you're talking about. Emotional diction, complex diction, didactic diction, but give a description of the diction. Likewise, with ethos, logos, and pathos and kairos, you want to say an appeal to ethos, an appeal to pathos, or he evoked sympathy. Any of those would be correct. All right, contextual quotes. Don't use quotes like air quotes around words if you're also going to use quotation marks. Just use quotation marks for exact quotes. This gets really distracting as a reader because then I go back to the text and then I see that you're kind of doing an air quote thing. So avoid that altogether. This is one we really need to work on. Chief Seattle wants Stevens to understand his point of view. That's actually your job. Your job is to show your reader how Chief Seattle shows the reader the point of view. You don't need to tell your reader that. Chief Seattle achieves his purpose. Again, that's your task. So avoid these kind of empty statements. Chief Seattle wrote a great speech. It is a great speech. We learned a little bit about the history of that speech. It's probably not even Seattle's speech, but it is a great speech. Seattle spoke with Stevens on numerous occasions. From the text, we don't know that. So don't invent scenarios and put the characters into them. You have to stay really close with the text in rhetorical analysis. He compared and contrasted. Someone said he was ranting and raving. A lot of people put those two words together, but remember they're opposites. Compared means they're looking at like things, and contrasted are unlike things. Ranting is when you are angry about something, and raving is when you laud it or you're very happy about it. So those are used incorrectly in the media quite frequently on television, and people just pick them up. All right, we need to work on close reading. I did a quick look at the text and noticed that most people didn't make a single mark on the text. You really need to read with a pencil with these. Okay, create some kind of a key, identify things. Sometimes I will put purpose on the left side and I'll put rhetorical strategies on the right. So go into the reading experience with a way to mark your text. All right, analytical writing. I went over this the last time. You only want to have a short introduction, maybe 2 or 3 sentences at the most. You need to have your claim, and then your body paragraph should be very detailed, and then you need a conclusion. This is not like creative writing, so just be aware this is a different form of writing that we're learning. All right, avoid pronouns, as I mentioned earlier. Who is the he? Who is the him? Avoid cliches. Now, a lot of people say she uses cliches, her statement was cliched. Cliches are those old, tired phrases. Someone said that he heard Seattle loud and clear. Well, we wouldn't have heard Seattle loud and clear because we couldn't hear him. We were reading the speech, and we don't know if he was loud or clear because we weren't there. So a person cannot be cliche. That's another thing you hear in the media frequently. That's used incorrectly. So just avoid cliches altogether, and then you'll be great. All right, here's a technique called the YYY technique. What I want you to do, it's kind of annoying, but you start out with the topic sentence. So Chief Seattle uses a simile to set up a pattern of comparisons. So in that sentence, I've identified the actual rhetorical device, simile, and then I've told you why Seattle used it, which gets into author's purpose. All right, my next sentence, I used an exact quote from the text. So my words are like stars that never change. That supports the first sentence. And then you ask that annoying question again. Why? All right, here's another level of analysis. By comparing his words to stars, he is teaching us an ethical value that his word is his bond. I probably should have avoided all those pronouns. Yet, the history of Native Americans is a string of broken promises. So that's a level of analysis that supports the direct quote, which supports the labeling of the rhetorical device. If you are unsure of doing rhetorical analysis and it doesn't flow freely yet, use that pattern, right? Label it, provide evidence of it, analyze it. Those 3 things. Okay, and then I even went one more further down. So if you've noticed, I have one more level of analysis there. Since Governor Stevens had just returned from Washington, D.C. with the intention of buying Indian land, Seattle knew that he had to show his intelligence, his awareness, and his culture. And that sentence that I pulled, that simile, shows all 3 of those. With carefully crafted diction, see, I've identified my diction, that could evoke Native American imagery and white American pragmatism. And that goes back to the thesis that I created. All right, and here it is again. So this is 5. This is 5 sentences. It's a nice meaty paragraph. So this is what you need to practice.